At 48 years old, I found myself in my office, staring out at the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean while mulling over a life-altering decision. My company had made me an offer. If I accepted, I'd walk away with a staggering $24 million. It was more money than I ever imagined having, enough to consider myself truly wealthy. But despite what seemed like a dream scenario, I couldn't shake the deep, gnawing misery. Sure, I was thriving in my career, but my personal life? A complete disaster. My name's Ethan Wright, Ethan, not Landon like the president. I come from a modest, blue-collar background, the kind of lower-middle-class family that knew the value of hard work. But in high school, I was the kid everyone called a screw-up. I hated the monotony of classes, and my guidance counselor flat out suggested I drop out and get a job. Looking back, I can't say I blame them. I was a royal pain. By some miracle, I managed to graduate, though it probably had more to do with the school wanting me gone than my academic prowess. Back then, the Vietnam War was in full swing, and like so many young men, I enlisted in the Army for a 3-year stint. My dad, an electrician, thought it would knock some sense into me and teach me a useful trade. Surprisingly, I flourished in basic training. The structure, the physical grind, it all clicked for me. I even volunteered for Ranger training, an intense, grueling 2-month ordeal at Fort Benning, Georgia, that prepared soldiers for the unforgiving jungles of Vietnam. I wasn't the biggest guy, just shy of 6 feet tall and weighing 170 pounds, but swimming kept me lean and fit. Those 2 months pushed me to my limits, sharpening my body and survival skills to a razor's edge. Not long after, I found myself in Vietnam, where the reality of war hit hard. I spent over a year and a half there before shrapnel tore through me, damaging my spine and bladder. Months in a VA hospital followed, but I was lucky. No incontinence, and today, my limp is barely noticeable. The inability to have kids wasn't a big deal to me back then, but later, it would haunt me in ways I never anticipated. At just 20 years old, discharged and back home, I had no clue what to do with my life. My combat skills didn't exactly translate to civilian jobs. My dad, always resourceful, found a VA program at Drexel University that included aptitude testing. After a full day of evaluations, Dr. Maxwell, the counselor, suggested I study engineering. Given my dismal high school record, I thought he was nuts, but he was convinced I had what it took to succeed in college. With his encouragement, I enrolled at Drexel as an electrical engineering major, and for the first time, I saw real pride in my parents' eyes. Around that time, I got an unexpected call from Ryan Parker, an old Army buddy. "Ethan, it's Ryan. I'm out of the Army." His voice brought back a flood of memories. "Ryan, man, it's great to hear from you. How'd you get my number? What happened?" He told me he'd lost a leg to a landmine but was doing fine with a prosthetic. "I'm in California, studying architecture at Caltech. I'm going to be an architect, Ethan." I laughed. Ryan had always been the smartest guy in our unit. "That's amazing, Ryan. I'm proud of you. My folks must have told you I'm studying engineering." "Yeah," he said. "Can you believe it? You, an engineer, and me, an architect? We're actually going to be professionals." The call left me energized, ready to dive into my studies. With my GI Bill, a small medical pension, and my parents' savings, I rented a tiny studio near campus. It wasn't much, just a bed, a sofa, a kitchenette, and a little bathroom, but it felt like mine. I set up a study area with a second-hand desk and an old computer. I was determined to make the most of this chance. The first 2 years flew by in a blur of textbooks and late-night study sessions. To my surprise, I did well on my exams. I was serious about building a future, which didn't leave much room for a social life. Still, I made a few friends, and we'd occasionally grab a beer or pizza. One Friday, my classmate Carl invited me to a sorority party at Penn. I almost said no, but something nudged me to go, and that night changed everything. That's when I met Sophie. She looked like the quintessential rich girl, dressed to the nines with diamond earrings that screamed money. My initial reaction was contempt, which she picked up on instantly. Feeling guilty, I grabbed a beer to smooth things over. Eventually, we started talking, and things got serious. I was terrified to tell her about my sterility, unsure how she'd react. But one day, Sophie beat me to it. With tears in her eyes, she said, "Ethan, I love you and want to be with you forever, but I don't want kids. I wouldn't be a good mother." I held her close, relieved. "Sophie, if you don't want kids, then I don't either." My secret stayed hidden, and her carelessness with birth control only reinforced our compatibility. Missing pills didn't matter, at least not for us. One afternoon, Sophie announced, "Ethan, my parents want to meet you. It's time." I felt a wave of dread. Sophie's family wasn't just wealthy, they were loaded. Her dad, Arthur Van Bennett, owned a massive construction company and was worth hundreds of millions. Her mom, Elaine, came from old money. I was sure they'd see me as a nobody. The day came, and a sleek black Lincoln Town car arrived to take us to their immaculate colonial mansion. I was in a foul mood, but Sophie reassured me as we walked inside. To my surprise, her parents welcomed me warmly. Elaine was polite but cautious, a petite woman with blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. She looked young for her age, probably mid-40s. I couldn't help but think, if Sophie ages like this, I've hit the jackpot. Her father, Arthur, insisted I call him by his first name. For a man of his wealth, his down-to-earth demeanor caught me off guard. Sophie's father, Arthur, was tall, impressive, and wealthy, yet he was warm and approachable. He took an immediate interest in my studies and background. As we left their home, he clapped me on the back and said, "Ethan, I'm impressed. Keep up your studies. I can always use a good engineer." Turning to Sophie, he joked, "You've got yourself a keeper." On the drive back, Sophie leaned into me, visibly relieved. I sighed, glad the meeting had gone well, but I started worrying about Sophie meeting my parents. The contrast between her family's estate and my parents' South Philly row house would be glaring, but I trusted my folks would make her feel welcome. The visit went smoothly. Sophie seemed surprised by how modestly my family lived, but handled it with grace. She and my mom bonded in the kitchen over a pot roast recipe, though I doubted Sophie had ever cooked much. My dad, however, pulled me aside for a word. "Ethan, Sophie's great and clearly loves you, but let's be real. She's used to a different kind of life. Engineering pays well, but it might not match her expectations. Just think about it," he said, giving my shoulder a pat. Later, as we sat in the parlor, my dad raised his glass. "To Ethan and Sophie, may your life together be long and joyful. Oh, and we're moving to Florida. Sold the house and bought a villa. We're leaving by the end of the month." I was stunned but happy for them, joking about keeping the guest room ready for visits. Sophie gave me a look I couldn't quite read, but I brushed it off. Sophie suggested we combine her parents' housing allowance with my rent and get a better apartment. It made sense, so we upgraded to a nice place nearby. Not long after, her dad bought her a BMW, claiming she needed it for school. I didn't argue. It wasn't my money. Senior year flew by. Sophie was busy with her studies and wedding plans, while I focused on maintaining my grades. We spent less and less time together, but 2 months before graduation, Sophie came home beaming. "Ethan, I got a part-time job. If it goes well, it'll be full-time after graduation," she said. She'd landed a probationary assistant editor role at a publishing house in Center City. "Geez, Sophie, we already barely see each other." "This'll make it worse," I grumbled. "I know, but this is a golden opportunity. Please be happy for me," she pleaded. Reluctantly, I forced a smile. "You'll be great, honey. They're lucky to have you." The schedule surprisingly worked out. She worked evenings when I had late classes, so we didn't lose much more time together. Our wedding day came quickly. The ceremony was extravagant. Over 200 guests, mostly her family and friends. I felt like I was just going through the motions. That evening, Arthur pulled me aside. "Ethan, I know you've been job hunting, but I want you to work for me. My technical department needs strengthening, and you'll train with Donna, our head engineer. It's a real job with room for growth, and I'll pay you more than anyone else." It was an offer I couldn't refuse, but we agreed Sophie and I would maintain our independence. That handshake sealed the deal. My parents gave us a beautiful sterling silver service for 12, a gift that must have stretched their finances. Sophie's parents, on the other hand, paid for a lavish 10-day honeymoon in Jamaica. I felt awkward accepting, but refusing would have been worse. Sophie and I clashed over where to live after the wedding. She wanted a luxury high-rise in Center City, close to her job and her parents' office. I insisted we rent something affordable and buy later. We have to make it on our own, Sophie, I said firmly. She eventually agreed, though grudgingly. We found a cozy two-bedroom, two-bath apartment near our jobs. She had her BMW, and I took the streetcar to work. It was convenient but stretched our budget, especially with new furniture. I kept a close eye on Sophie's spending, and we managed to make the place look nice. Work at Arthur's company was demanding but rewarding. He kept his word, pairing me with Don Malone, a seasoned engineer who taught me more in a month than I'd learned in college. I stayed late often, eager to absorb as much as I could. Sophie, meanwhile, quickly advanced from assistant to full-fledged editor within 2 years. She earned a good salary, but her aspirations didn't waver. She still wanted a luxury apartment and often criticized our current place, even calling it squalid once. Her attitude strained our relationship. I stayed in touch with Ryan Parker, who constantly urged me to move to California. "Ethan, you'd love it out here," he'd insist. I always laughed at his persistence. One Friday evening, I planned a romantic night for Sophie. I reserved a table at a fancy restaurant, had 24 roses in a crystal vase, and bought diamond earrings in a velvet box. I wanted to rekindle some of the spark we seemed to be losing. It was our second wedding anniversary, but Sophie hadn't mentioned it, and I was beginning to think she had forgotten. As I glanced at the roses I had bought, neatly arranged in a crystal vase on the sideboard, the phone rang. "Ethan," Sophie's voice sounded rushed, "I'm really sorry, but I'll be late tonight. We have a million things to do for Victor's new novel. I'll grab something to eat and see you around 10. Before I could reply, she hung up. I stared at the phone for a moment before putting it down. Did she even remember it was our anniversary? It seemed like everything else, her work, her projects, and Victor Moreau, was more important than us. I couldn't shake the growing sense of neglect in our relationship. We were both so consumed by our careers that we had drifted apart, and Sophie's distance only made it worse. Victor Moreau. His name alone was enough to sour my mood. Sophie had been excited about the launch of his novel, talking about it constantly for months. But after meeting him at a reception a while back, I couldn't share her enthusiasm. He had been insufferably arrogant, greeting me with a crushing handshake that felt more like a challenge than a courtesy. When he mockingly called me the engineer, Sophie had looked embarrassed. The way she spent the rest of the evening by his side, laughing at his jokes, made me uneasy. And that dress, a slinky black number, felt inappropriate, considering how closely Moreau seemed to hover around her. After that night, Sophie stopped mentioning Moreau altogether. If I brought him up, she'd quickly change the subject, which only deepened my suspicion. Her work hours grew longer, and our marriage began to feel like an afterthought. The intimacy we once shared had all but vanished, and I was left questioning what, if anything, remained of our bond. A week before our anniversary, I decided to surprise Sophie at work. I'd make a gesture, try to rekindle some closeness. I planned to take her to dinner, hoping to remind her of what we once had. At Crown Publishing, I accidentally got off on the executive floor. As I wandered the hallway, I ran into Daniel Harper, the VP. "Good to see you, Ethan," he said warmly, clapping me on the shoulder. "It's been a while. What brings you here?" "I thought I'd take my wife out for dinner," I replied. "She's been busy with the Moreau project, and I figured she could use a break." Harper smiled. "The Moreau thing? That's been over for a while. The book's at the printer. Victor's still in the VIP apartment upstairs, but Sophie deserves a good dinner. Go get her." His words hit me like a jolt. The project was over? Then why had Sophie been staying late so often? My mind raced as I headed to her office. I saw her in the hallway, and she froze when she spotted me. "Ethan, what are you doing here?" she blurted. "I thought we could have dinner," I said, trying to sound casual. "It's been a while, and I wanted to spend some time together." Her expression shifted, and I caught a flash of irritation. "I can't," she said firmly. "I'm busy with Victor's novel. Please, be patient. This will all be over soon. I promise." She patted my cheek, an awkward, perfunctory gesture, and hurried back to her office. I left the building feeling dismissed. The roses and dinner reservations suddenly felt pointless. When I got home, I threw the roses, vase and all, into the trash. The diamond earrings I had bought her went into my desk drawer, where I shoved them to the back. That night, I pretended to be asleep when Sophie finally came home around 1 a.m., freshly showered and reeking of guilt. The next morning, I couldn't shake my suspicions. I needed proof. On my lunch break, I visited a private investigator, Linda Romero, whose office was near Van Bennett Construction. I explained the situation, my voice tight with suppressed frustration. "Linda, I don't care about legal evidence. I just want confirmation," I told her. She gave me a sympathetic look. "We'll do our best. Here's the contract and fee schedule. Sign it and send it back with a check. We'll start Monday." I agreed, shook her hand, and left feeling slightly more in control of the situation. When I got home, Sophie was in the kitchen, visibly upset. "God damn it, Ethan. Where were you? Do you even remember it's our anniversary? Did you get me a card or do anything thoughtful?" Her tone was accusatory, but I saw through her deflection. "Sophie," I replied calmly, "today is the 11th. Our anniversary was yesterday. I canceled our dinner reservations and threw the roses in the trash. If you care, the gift is in my desk." Her face paled, and she sat down heavily on the sofa. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she said quietly. "I don't know where I am half the time. This campaign has me so frazzled. But it's over now. Let's put the last few months behind us and work on our marriage." Her guilt was evident, and I knew the Moreau project had ended weeks ago. Her words felt hollow, but I didn't argue. The following days were tense. Sophie started coming home earlier, as if trying to prove her commitment, but it was too late. The trust had been shattered, and every interaction felt like a performance. A few days later, Ryan Parker called. "Ethan, have you thought about moving out here? The opportunities are amazing. We could use someone like you." "It's an idea, Ryan," I replied noncommittally. "We'll talk about it." Later that week, Linda Romero called. "Ethan, we haven't found any evidence of an affair, so we're refunding part of the fee. However, Victor Moreau has a reputation. He's been tied to harassment claims and 2 divorces linked to affairs. I'm sorry we couldn't be more help." I thanked her and hung up. Proof or no proof, the damage was done. Our marriage was over in every way that mattered. I was disappointed but resigned. The truth had become inescapable, and it was time to act. I called Robert Blake, an attorney, and scheduled an appointment for 10 days later. It was time to end the marriage. Meanwhile, Sophie and I lived under the same roof, tiptoeing around each other, avoiding confrontation, but unable to escape the tension. 2 days before my appointment, Sophie rushed into the house, looking agitated. "Ethan, sit down," she said, her voice trembling. "I need to talk to you." She paused, her anxiety almost palpable. "I know we didn't want kids, but I'm pregnant." Her words hit me like a punch. "We're going to be parents, Ethan. Please don't be angry. Please don't be upset," she pleaded, looking at me with wide, fearful eyes. I was stunned. For a moment, I couldn't even process it. Then the reality set in. Sophie had always been careless with birth control, and now she was pregnant. I had no doubt the child was Victor Moreau's, not mine. The absurdity of her trying to convince me otherwise hit me hard. A mix of rage and devastation flooded me. My voice was cold. "I'll pack a few things and leave. I'll come back for the rest later." Sophie looked terrified, tears welling up. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. You don't know how sorry I am." I looked at her, pain and disbelief in my eyes. "Why, Sophie? Was our marriage so unimportant to you?" She cried harder. "I don't know, Ethan. Maybe it was the excitement, the glamour. I got caught up in it all. I was weak and foolish. I let myself be seduced by Victor and the job. I didn't realize how deep I was in until it was too late. Lying about the baby was wrong. I'm ashamed." She took a deep breath, almost pleading. "Is there any way we can fix this?" "No," I replied firmly. "I'm seeing Robert Blake. I'll get a lawyer. We'll split what we have and get the divorce." I packed a bag and left. Sophie's sobs echoed in the house as I walked out. Telling Arthur Van Bennett, my mentor and close friend, was the hardest part. When I broke the news, he seemed almost crushed. Why, Ethan? Why? Haven't I treated you well? You're like a son to me, he said, his eyes filled with tears. Arthur, I can't explain. Sophie will. But she left me no choice. My throat tightened. You've been like a second father to me, and I'm grateful. But I can't explain more. Arthur sighed deeply and placed a hand on my shoulder. Okay, Ethan, do what you need to do. Just promise you'll let me help you if you need anything. I nodded, my emotions threatening to spill over, and left. For the next week, I stayed at a Hilton hotel, struggling to process everything. I filed for divorce, knowing Sophie wouldn't contest it. Once the paperwork was in motion, I called Ryan Parker and agreed to move to Los Angeles. Within a week, I was on a plane. Ryan had already submitted my resume to his company, and I started the job a few days after arriving. During my first weeks, I stayed with Ryan and his wife, Monica, who welcomed me warmly. Monica, who I'd only spoken to on the phone, was a small, striking woman with dark hair and kind brown eyes. She quickly made me feel like more than just a guest. Monica became a special friend, and her kindness was a lifeline as I immersed myself in work, desperate for distraction. The days were manageable, but the nights were brutal, filled with dreams of Sophie and the painful memories. Sometimes, I drank too much and let my anger spill out in destructive ways. I'd break something, then pass out on the sofa, hoping the pain would dull when I woke up. I missed the woman I had married, the Sophie who had once been loving and kind, before the betrayal. I wondered if I could have done more, but I couldn't forgive her. The child wasn't mine, and I wasn't ready to accept that she cheated. Ryan and Monica did everything they could to help. They invited me on weekends, barbecues, camping trips, and even blind dates, which I avoided at first. Eventually, I relented and agreed to a few. I met some nice women, but none of them could replace what I had with Sophie. Weekends by their pool were the only times I felt some peace. But things started to get complicated. Monica's bikinis became more revealing, and awkward moments began to happen. She'd walk through the hall in her underwear, or lounge in a barely there bikini, and I'd feel uncomfortable, unsure of how to react. One Saturday, Ryan went to pick up beer and insisted I stay. When I came out of the bathroom, Monica was standing in a short silk robe, wide open with nothing underneath. She took my hand, pulling me toward the patio. Monica, tie your robe. Ryan will be home soon, I stammered. She ignored me. Ethan, stop feeling sorry for yourself. You're not the only one who's been screwed over. You can't avoid women forever. Monica let the robe fall and walked away, tying it back up quickly. We're not doing anything like that. Ryan and I thought this might help you snap out of it. When Ryan returned later, grinning and unaware of the tension, I was torn between relief and guilt. To ease the pressure, I started going on more blind dates. Surprisingly, some of the women were nice, but none could replace what I lost with Sophie. I loved her, even if I knew I had to let her go. Ryan and Monica kept me grounded. They continually invited me over, set me up on dates, and tried to help me heal. Arthur and Elaine Van Bennett checked in occasionally, too, their concern never waning. As the weeks passed, I slowly started moving forward. I spent weekends with Ryan and Monica, by their pool or on trips, finding moments of peace amid the chaos of my emotions. Eventually, I started to feel like I might be okay. The pain of Sophie's betrayal would never fully fade, but the constant presence of friends helped me heal, one day at a time. I joined a health club, took a cooking class, and even considered joining a library group. Ryan and Monica were happy to see me getting back to life. I kept busy with work and occasional dates, slowly recovering from the breakup with Sophie. 2 years passed since I moved to the West Coast, and life became routine. Then everything changed. One Thursday evening, my mom called, crying. Your dad had a massive stroke, and he's gone, she sobbed. I felt lightheaded, but I knew I had to stay strong. I called Ryan immediately. Ryan, my dad died. I need you to contact personnel and get me a leave of absence. Of course, Ethan. Don't worry about anything here. Just take care of your family, Ryan said. I packed quickly and was on a plane to Tampa within hours. I landed early the next morning, rented a car, and drove to the house. When I arrived, I found a note from Mrs. Simmons, the neighbor, asking me to call her. "Mrs. Simmons, this is Ethan Wright. I just got your note," I said, but she interrupted. "Ethan, your mom had a heart attack and was rushed to the hospital. She'll be fine, though, so stay calm. I'll be right over." 5 minutes later, Mrs. Simmons, or Katie, arrived and explained everything. My mom had experienced neck and arm pains, and Katie had called for emergency help. Mom was taken to the ER, examined, and scheduled for bypass surgery later in the week. I headed for the door, but Katie stopped me. "Wait, Ethan. Give me 15 minutes to get ready, and I'll go with you. You don't need directions to the hospital." Feeling relieved by her presence, I agreed. "Thanks, Katie. I appreciate your support." We reached the hospital, and I found my mom in shock. She didn't want the surgery, not knowing how to cope with Dad's death. I convinced her she needed to do it for me, and after some persuasion, she agreed. The surgery was a success, and within a week, she was home, taking short walks with me. During her hospital stay, I arranged my dad's funeral. It was well attended, but the shock of his passing at just 60 lingered. I insisted my mom not attend, given her recent surgery, promising we would visit his grave when she was ready. While staying with my mom, I began to rethink my future. I didn't want to leave her alone. After talking it over with Ryan and Monica, I decided to quit my job and move closer to her. Ryan arranged for a moving company to pack and ship my things. Mom's recovery was impressive, though she still needed afternoon naps. With the help of Katie, who was also widowed, Mom was doing well. I decided it was time to look for a job. Mom suggested we pool our resources and start a business together. "I have confidence in you, Ethan. We can be partners. I'll handle the office side, and you can take care of the technical work." I was surprised but intrigued. I saw potential, especially with small contractors needing engineering services. Ryan encouraged me to go for it. So Mom and I pooled our money and opened a small office. I advertised in local trade publications and introduced myself to contractors. Slowly, work started trickling in. After a few months, we were covering expenses, though we hadn't turned a profit. Then, out of nowhere, I received a bid request for a mid-size office building. I worked tirelessly on the bid, minimizing my profit margin, and managed to win the contract. I had to expand quickly to meet the deadline, but I had enough time to hire more help. The work kept coming, and I expanded 3 more times over the next few years, eventually occupying an entire floor in a new high-rise. The first couple of years were about building the business, leaving me with little time for a social life. After 3 years, I finally had enough help to cut back on my hours. I rejoined the gym and started working out again. I even tried to get better at cooking, though I remained hopeless in the kitchen. At the gym, I met a woman named Laura Hayes. She was about 5 feet 5 inches, nicely built, and around my age. One day, I noticed her leotard's seam was about to tear. I awkwardly approached her, trying to warn her without embarrassing her. Miss, I really don't want to," I stammered. She smiled. "You're really not very good at this, are you? You should practice before trying to introduce yourself to a girl," she giggled, making it less awkward. I mentioned the tear in her leotard, and she quickly ran to the locker room. For the next week, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I assumed she was too embarrassed to come back, but the following week, she approached me. "Hi," she said. "I'm Laura Hayes. Thanks for warning me." I smiled. "You're welcome. Would you have lunch with me today?" She agreed, and we spent the next few weeks getting to know each other. Laura was 28, divorced, and had a 3-year-old daughter named Emily. Laura worked in public relations for an advertising company near the gym. After our third date, I met Emily. She was a charming little girl with blonde hair and blue eyes. Nothing like her mother. Emily quickly warmed up to me, and Laura was surprised, saying her daughter usually took longer to open up to strangers. Dating Laura became even more enjoyable because of Emily. I liked Laura a lot, but I didn't love her the way I had loved Sophie. It wasn't fair to compare them, but I knew I was different now. Laura was beautiful, dynamic, and had a strong personality, but something felt missing. Laura's kindness, especially toward Emily, made me appreciate her even more. Our relationship was comfortable, but it lacked the intensity I'd had with Sophie. There were affectionate moments, some kissing and fumbling, but we weren't as passionate as before. One evening, after dinner and wine, Laura suddenly became more aggressive. We had passionate lovemaking and fell asleep together. The next morning, she explained that the wine had lowered her inhibitions, and she wanted to make love. I reassured her everything was fine, and we continued dating for months, becoming very comfortable with each other. I introduced Laura and Emily to my mom, who had retired. Mom adored Emily, treating her like a granddaughter. Emily loved her Nana, and everything seemed right. Eventually, we decided it was silly to keep running between our places, so I bought a house in a gated golf course community. We moved in a couple of months later. We never discussed marriage, as both of us had bad experiences before, and we were content without that commitment. Emily began calling me Daddy, and it warmed my heart. I embraced the role. Life felt stable. The years passed quickly. My business thrived, and I had a great team to keep things running smoothly. Laura was doing well too, climbing the corporate ladder in her public relations firm. However, as she advanced, she worked longer hours and traveled more. I began to notice changes in her. She seemed distant. Our sex life had become sporadic. What was once frequent had now become infrequent. She would often claim she was tired or had her period. I started to suspect something was wrong, fearing it might be happening again. I decided to talk to Laura. One evening, I sat her down and said, "Laura, we need to talk. You seem distant. It feels like you've forgotten I'm here. What's going on?" She stared at me, then snapped, "What the hell are you talking about, Ethan? Are you getting paranoid? Are you accusing me of something? Get off my back." She stormed off, slamming the bedroom door. I stood there, stunned. This was not like Laura. She had never spoken to me that way before. The next morning, she emerged tearfully apologizing. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I've been under a lot of stress at work. A big client is threatening to leave," she explained. I wasn't entirely convinced but didn't press further. I wanted to believe things would get better. However, Laura's behavior didn't change. Her late nights and business trips became more frequent. Something didn't feel right. I couldn't ignore it anymore, so I hired a private investigator. I hated the idea, but my suspicions had grown too strong. I provided all the details and a hefty payment for the investigation. For the next few weeks, things between Laura and me remained strained. We avoided arguments but couldn't ignore the tension. Finally, the investigator's report came in. Laura had been meeting a man named Stephen Gentry, a 48-year-old divorced man. They had dined together, held hands, kissed, and checked into hotels. She also saw him during her business trips. I was hurt but not as devastated as I had been with Sophie. I had learned from the past, but it still stung. I contacted my attorney, thinking that since we weren't married, the separation would be simple. He warned me it could still be messy and suggested we come to a mutual agreement to avoid court. The following Friday, after dinner, I decided to confront Laura. I couldn't wait any longer. "How long have you been seeing him?" I asked softly. Laura was shocked. Then she began crying. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I hoped you wouldn't find out," she sobbed. "How long, Laura?" "I know his name, Stephen Gentry. Do you love him?" She lowered her head, tears streaming down her face. "About 8 months. I saw him at the mall. He's my ex-husband, Emily's father." It felt like a punch to the gut. "Emily's father?" "No, I'm Emily's father," I exclaimed. "No one will take that away from me." Laura cowered, sobbing uncontrollably. "You are Emily's father. I just meant he's her biological father. Do you love him?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "I don't know," she cried. "It was a mistake. I couldn't say no to him. It was like when we first met. I couldn't stay away from him." She was gasping for air, looking broken. I handed her tissues, feeling deflated. My anger had faded, replaced by deep disappointment. I realized this was the end. Laura wasn't the same person anymore, and I felt like I was back at the start, dealing with another failed relationship. Despite not being the love of my life, her betrayal hurt deeply. "I'll be sleeping in the guest suite tonight," I told her. "Please move out as soon as you can. We'll tell people we drifted apart, like my mom and Emily." Leaving the room, I felt like an old man the next morning. I tried to focus on work, but it was tough. When I returned home, Laura was gone. She had taken most of her things but left a letter. "Dearest Ethan, I'm deeply sorry for the hurt I've caused. You've done nothing to deserve my behavior. I don't understand my attraction to Stephen. I know he will destroy me. I vowed never to see him again, but I'm unsure if I can keep that promise. You've been kind and loving. None of this is your fault. I've come to love you, which makes my actions even more horrible. Please don't hate me. All my love, Laura. I collapsed into a chair, the letter falling to the floor. I would miss Laura, but I also felt relief. I needed solitude to clear my head. A thought struck me. I needed to take care of Stephen Gentry, for Laura and for myself. I drove to his apartment building, and when he answered, I shoved him inside and closed the door. He yelled, "I'm gonna tear your head off." But within moments, he was on the floor, moaning. I pulled him into a sitting position. Listen carefully, Stephen. My name is Ethan Wright. My friend's name is Laura Hayes. Understand? I slapped him. He nodded quickly. Good. I'm going to show you pain, but I won't leave many marks. For the next 20 minutes, I inflicted pain until he threw up twice and begged me to stop. I grabbed a glass of water from his kitchen, threw it in his face, and let him drink. Pack your things and leave this area. Try California, Oregon, or Washington. If you're here in 24 hours, you'll end up in a wheelchair for life. Understand? He nodded vigorously. I drove home and showered for half an hour, feeling sick. I told myself it was for Laura, to free her from Stephen, but deep down, I knew it was partly for revenge. I tried to shake it off. The next day, Stephen was gone. Talking to my mom and Emily was tough. They couldn't understand, and I refused to go into details. Emily threatened to fly home, but both Laura and I convinced her to stay at school. I suspected Laura eventually told Emily what had happened. When I spoke to Emily, she seemed subdued and sad. "I'll always love you, Dad," she said, and it warmed my heart. Days turned into weeks. I had to decide about the company. Should I sell it? The potential buyer was patient, but had given me a deadline. I procrastinated, unsure. Finally, a week before the deadline, I called and canceled the buyout. I would keep the company. Months passed, and I became reflective. At 49, I realized I had a successful company and a daughter who wasn't biologically mine, but whom I loved deeply. Stacy called every week, and I lived a solitary existence. Did I miss Laura? Sure, but it was more like missing Ryan and Monica. We had good years together, but we moved on. The last I heard, Laura was doing well at her job and dating. She would find someone. Did I mind being alone? Not really. I had gotten used to it. "Ethan, you have a visitor," Gail, my secretary, said over the intercom. "I'm busy," I replied. "Damn it, Gail, handle it for me." She persisted. "Ethan, I think you'll want to see him. It's Arthur Van Bennett." I froze. Then I jumped up and rushed to the front office. Standing there, looking much younger than his 70-something years, was Arthur Van Bennett. I hugged him tightly, a lump in my throat. He laughed. "Okay, Ethan, let me breathe." I stepped back, still in disbelief. This was my first time seeing him in about 20 years. We quickly went to my office, catching up on life. Arthur told me he and Elaine had recently sold their company and moved to Naples. They'd always discussed it, but never acted on it. 1 month ago, on a whim, they flew down, looked at some properties, and bought a Gulfront home. Arthur asked about my business and why I decided not to sell. I explained my reasons, and he nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Ethan, you know you'll have to visit us now that we're so close. Elaine would be really upset if you didn't," he said with a grin, his tone lighthearted. I smiled and assured him I would. We reminisced for a while, recalling the old days of my company, the struggles of starting from nothing, trying to make ends meet, and the small victories that kept me going. It was amazing to think how far I'd come, from scraping by to being able to sustain a successful business. I saw a twinkle in Arthur's eyes, and suddenly, it hit me like a ton of bricks. My God, what an idiot I was. I had never suspected, but now it seemed so obvious. It was Arthur who had given my company the push it needed. The connections, the timing, the opportunities. It had all started with his call. I was stunned. I stumbled over my words, trying to express my gratitude, but he waved me off with a chuckle. Don't be silly, Ethan, he said dismissively. All I did was call in a couple of favors. You took the ball and ran with it. The success of your company is all you. Everyone can see the excellence of your work. It was all you, Ethan. I felt a strange mix of emotions, pride, gratitude, and a little shame, too. I had always thought my success was solely due to my own efforts, but hearing Arthur's words made me realize how much of it had been a result of others helping me along the way. I didn't want to diminish my hard work, but I couldn't deny that a little outside help had played a role in getting me where I was. Still, it felt good to hear him say that. It reminded me that sometimes we all need a little help to succeed. There was a lull in the conversation, and I could sense Arthur was waiting for me to ask the question that had been on my mind ever since I saw him. I hesitated, not sure if I was ready for what I might hear, but I couldn't hold back any longer. I had to know. Arthur, how's Sophie? Is she okay? I hope she's happy. Arthur exhaled softly, his eyes briefly looking down as he gathered his thoughts. I've been waiting a long time for you to ask, Ethan, he said, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place. Relief, maybe. Thank you. Elaine will be happy you did. It means a lot to us. He shifted in his chair, taking a deep breath. It's been a long time since you left, Ethan, and a lot has happened to her. Sophie lost the baby about a month after you left. My heart lurched at the words, and I felt a lump in my throat. The doctors said she couldn't conceive again after that. I don't remember exactly why. I wasn't sure I understood it all at the time, but that's what they said. The words hung heavy in the air, and I sat there in stunned silence. The baby. Our baby. The thought hit me harder than I expected. I had never fully processed what it meant when Sophie lost the baby. I hadn't even thought about it in years, but hearing Arthur say it now brought it all rushing back. The divorce and everything left her clinically depressed, Ethan, Arthur continued. But don't start blaming yourself. What happened to Sophie was her own doing. She knew that. She called it her stupidity, and it destroyed her world. We were really worried about her. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to block out the pain. I couldn't blame myself, but part of me still felt responsible. I had left her, abandoned her at the worst possible time. It took months of therapy for her to recover. Arthur went on, his voice softer now. But she did. And in a way, what happened changed her. It made her more mature, more responsible, and more compassionate. It wasn't easy for her, but she made it through. I nodded, not knowing what to say. I didn't know Sophie anymore, not really. She had changed, and I had changed too. The woman she had become seemed so different from the person I had once known, and I wasn't sure how to feel about it. When things settled down, Arthur continued, Sophie told us she wanted to study medicine. At first, we thought it was part of her depression, but she was adamant. She wanted to do it. She enrolled at Penn's medical school and became an MD, specializing in pediatric oncology. She knew she'd never have children, and she wanted to help other kids. I was floored. Sophie, a doctor? A pediatric oncologist? It was almost impossible to picture. This was not the woman I had known. She had always been so creative, so passionate about writing and literature. Medicine had never seemed like her path, but I could see it now. I could understand why she might have chosen that path, given everything she'd been through. Maybe it was part of her healing process. Maybe it was her way of turning her pain into something meaningful. Do you know why we moved here, Ethan? Arthur asked suddenly, breaking my thoughts. The biggest reason? We wanted to be near Sophie. She's the chief of pediatric oncology at the cancer center at the university in Tampa now. I blinked in surprise. She's here? Yes, Arthur confirmed. She's been there for a couple of months now. Ethan, would you like to see her? Maybe say hello? Don't panic. She doesn't know I'm here. She'd be upset if she knew I suggested it, but she knows you're in Tampa. Do you think that influenced her decision to take the job? I felt my pulse quicken, the idea of seeing Sophie after all these years filling me with a mixture of excitement and dread. Could I face her? What would it be like? So many questions rushed through my mind. I don't know, I stammered, overwhelmed by the idea of it all. I need to process this. It's a lot to take in. Arthur stood up, giving me a sympathetic look. Take your time, Ethan. Think it over. I'll be in touch. I watched him leave, and the weight of everything he had told me settled on me like a thick blanket. Sophie. She was here in Tampa. She had become a doctor. She was so different from the person I had known. Yet in some ways, I realized she was still the same. I had so many questions, but I wasn't sure I was ready for the answers. I spent the rest of the afternoon sitting at my desk, replaying Arthur's words in my mind. Did I still love Sophie? How had I felt when we were together, and how did I feel now? These were questions I had avoided for years, but now they were unavoidable. I knew I loved her, but the woman she had become, could I love her too? What did I even want from her? A few days later, I got an invitation from Elaine to visit them in Naples. It was a sunny Saturday, and I found myself driving down I-75 to their house. I told myself I wasn't going to think about Sophie, but that was impossible. Every mile felt like it took me closer to something I couldn't quite understand. When I arrived, I walked into the sunroom and saw her standing by the sliding glass doors. She was about 20 feet away, silhouetted against the sunlight. My breath caught in my throat. I knew it was her. It was like no time had passed at all. "Sophie," I said softly, almost as a whisper. "Hello, Ethan," she replied, her voice calm. "It's good to see you." She extended her hand, and I took it, both of us shaking hands as if we were meeting for the first time. "I hope you're not angry with me or my parents," she said, her voice a little uncertain. "I begged them to let me do this." "No, of course not," I reassured her. "It's good to see you again." She smiled, and I couldn't help but notice how beautiful she still was. We moved into the solarium and sat down, and at first, the conversation was awkward. But then we both started to laugh, and the tension began to ease. As we spoke, I found myself warming to her again, not just as the woman I had once loved, but as someone completely new, someone I wanted to know. We spent the day together, talking about our lives and sharing stories. Sophie had changed, but in some ways, she was still the same. The woman I had loved was still there, but now there was so much more to her. I couldn't stop thinking about it. As the day came to an end, I asked, "Sophie, would you like to have dinner with me?" "I'd love to, Ethan," she said, "but I'm due at the center tonight. Can we do it tomorrow?" And we did. We've been dating for the past 2 weeks now. Dating. I guess that's the right word. I know I love her. I've always loved her. And now, more than ever, I love the woman she's become. Does she feel the same about me? We haven't discussed it yet, but I'm hopeful.